Safety, along with quality and cost, among other things, those three really are one of the most important elements of field construction operations. Safety is heavily regulated. There's extensive federal, state, local regulations that drive compliance needs. And also they're very, very specific, and there's very high levels of enforcement. And fundamentally, safety is one of those key elements of construction outcomes and making them successful. Rarely do you find an unsafe job site that is productive or one that delivers well in terms of quality. And that typically is driving construction schedules, cost overruns, and generally unsuccessful project outcomes. And then the other thing is, in terms of safety, you have to consider a company's longevity. Safety is one of those benchmarks by which companies are assessed, firstly, for things like workers' compensation coverage, and the cost of that insurance premium can be very, very high if companies have a poor safety record. And furthermore, most owners and general contractors, when they're looking at subcontracting out and awarding projects, will ask for a subcontractor's safety history, safety management system, and they'll ask for that information on how a company actually manages, performs its responsibilities vis-a-vis safety and management. And oftentimes, if a company can't stand up to the scrutiny of that, they just won't be awarded the project. So, bottom line, for all of the above, companies that don't do a good job of health and safety don't end up sticking around for very long, and probably rightly so. Safety is of critical importance. So.
And I think, effective safety management, like almost everything on a job site, it can't be managed or improved if you're not measuring it. So in safety, involves a lot of different field tasks, inspections, checklists, toolbox talks, pre-task plans, accident and incident reporting, credential management. The list really kind of goes on and on. Site access, insurances. And practically, a lot of this falls on the foreman to manage. The foreman is managing a lot and wearing many hats on a job site, and safety is just simply one of those. If you kind of think about where safety begins, foremen are really the pointy end of the safety stick when it comes to keeping their crews safe. They're also the ones that are responsible for materials, information, staffing, equipment, planning, etc. So if you can imagine, safety is just one of many tasks that can fall by the wayside if there are not measures in place to ensure a safe job site and it can get done easily. So if you think about this and all the things that a foreman is required to do on a job site, it's pretty easy to imagine that, inefficient safety processes, i.e. doing everything on paper, can lead to being either less important or just less executed because it's not accessible and it's not easy. At the end of the day, foremen need more streamlined tools to make their lives easier. And managing complex safety management systems on paper, like most all processes, adds to that level of complexity. Safety is one of those domains of the foreman responsibility, really, that we're starting to see become more and more digitized, and that's great. That's progress. That's as a vendor in the space, we want to see that for all contractors. And I think it'll take some time, to get there, but it's a really important thing because this is taking some of the weight off of the foreman's shoulders, and it starts to become a really solid, information and data that we can capture on the job site. So they're just kind of some things that come to mind. But, Guy, I know obviously you are a kind of a data aficionado. So what are your thoughts there? Take it from here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to build on that concept of data that you started to introduce, because I think that's critical. Safety, as much as anything else, is all about behavior. So you can do an awful lot to establish systems and processes, but ultimately achieving safety compliance is about promoting, achieving, and changing safe work behaviors. And this can be quite tricky in the construction industry for various different reasons. To begin with, right, you achieve safe work practices through training and acculturation, a little bit around hiring. And then once you've established that sort of benchmark, it's all about constantly measuring, checking, and validating through testing and sort of compliance initiatives. And then on an ongoing basis, looking for areas for improvement. And moreover, safety on construction projects is never one and done. You know, when the work phase changes, when crews change, when new subcontractors come and go, work activities change, the risks change, and the behaviors can all change. So it's incredibly dynamic. And ultimately, what that all means is when you start to bring all the different parts together of workflows and processes and people, there's an awful lot of things that you are assessing and measuring against. And ultimately, what all that combines to deliver is an absolute data nightmare. And it's very, very tricky to try and build all of that stuff up, or rather, it can be if it's all done on paper. And so what we see and what we try and advocate for, whether it's timekeeping, production tracking, or anything, is that for folks that are essentially trying to improve the processes, whether that's timekeeping or safety, anything that's done on paper remains really, really cumbersome. And, you know, if you're generating, or rather you should be generating all that data, you know, practically, if you're doing it on paper, you really can't make sense of it, right? You're generating a huge amount of information but not making the most of it. And fundamentally, when we see people doing everything on paper, there's just this much lower level of engagement because you can't measure, you can't generate those KPIs. People do it for compliance, but they're not really using it to generate the best insights off the back of it. And that can have significant downstream impacts, right? It can result in safety processes being less well implemented. But more generally, what it means is that people cannot reliably or effectively measure the effectiveness of their safety programs. And, you know, to go back to the point that you made, Greg, like, you cannot manage what you don't measure, and people should be aggressively managing safety. And so if data is essentially what you're looking to measure against, manual processes for safety creates a real challenge for construction companies in actually achieving a measurable, verifiable safety management platform. And fundamentally, I think that's the real key issue that we are trying to highlight, or that we advocate through, you know, improved safety management processes with technology.
We probably don't have enough time in this session to actually cover all, but try to kind of whittle it down to a few key areas. So, you know, above all, you know, there are many. It's been, especially when you consider that safety is also about the health of the workers, right? Your most valuable asset is, in fact, your labor and your workers. And then the environmental impact of the work being performed, you know, which can be very onerous depending on the type of work that actually is. But for now, let's consider some of the kind of key responsibilities of the foreman, going back to the foreman, who's really the tip of the safety spear here. You know, toolbox talks, we hear, you know, tailgate talks, safety talks, whatever kind of naming convention you want to use. But, you know, those are an informal opportunity to review an activity, and it could be unrelated to the construction, but around the job site, and discuss, you know, as a crew, how safety risk associated with this can be managed and averted, and how you can take proper precautions. It's intended to get people to start thinking in the mindset of being safe on a job site and ensuring safety throughout, you know, their daily activities. Another example of this, you know, form to highlight, you know, would be JHA, so job hazard analysis or safety assessment. You kind of use those interchangeably too. You know, pre-task planning. There are many different forms like this can take, but really, you know, as a whole, when you hear of these forms and these processes, it's really kind of a formal process, you know, to consider the tasks, risks, and, you know, controls associated with the task to be performed. You know, we are going to go out and we are laying rebar today, and we need to make sure we're taking proper precautions related to that specific task for that day, because that's top of mind for us. And these things, you know, need to be documented. They should be detailed too. And also, you know, all the craft workers should be signing off on these, you know, once complete. We talk about data, you know, that is an element of data in capturing who was actually in attendance. They should also be done, you know, before this work is actually taking place. Are there any changes in work? And on a construction site, you know, a guy in your experience, and you well know, things are constantly changing. You know, work is always changing. So JHAs or, you know, pre-test plans, safety assessments, they can happen at a moment's notice. And foremen need to have access to tools that enable them to actually manage these talks, to complete them, you know, at a moment's notice. So capture who's in attendance for those talks. So we talk about technology and systems, and that's why it's so critical. It needs to be real time and accessible. And really, I'll stop there because, Guy, I really want to hear your feedback. But those are two critical ones that kind of happen before the work even begins, and it stand out to me. But Guy, I'll let you talk about some of the others, you know, you've experienced or you know that are, you know, incredibly critical to the overall safety, you know, of a job and of a contractor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Greg, I think you touched on some of the key ones that sort of happen before the work starts. And that's obviously a huge part about developing that mindset
Mhm.
around safe work practice and behavior. But a huge part of safety management is measuring compliance on an ongoing basis, establishing adherence to the systems and processes. What did we say we were going to do? And practically, what have we done and how are we doing against it? And if you think about that, some of these workflows are pretty numerous, right? They might include the formal inspections, site walk downs, checklists, observations, whether that's by foremen, superintendents, or even construction project management that might go out and have a responsibility to do some of that work, on an ad hoc basis. You might have formal inspections on a pre-task or during the day basis of things like scaffolds, man lifts, ladders, elevated works platforms, things that tend to be very frequent in nature and generate a lot of really, really insightful data.
Mhm.
Then you have other aspects that are a bit more safety critical, right? Permit to work that have a significant impact if they're not done safely, that can be deadly, right? Lockout, tag out, elevated works platforms, floor penetrations, confined space entry, contaminated environments, or oxygen deficient environments. All of those, if they're not done properly, can have devastating consequences. Those are just some of the pre-task, the inspections that are done during the course of the day. But then again, there are things that ideally happen less frequently in the event of, say, an incident. So
Right.
I say less frequently, you actually want lots of occurrences, but fewer incidents. So what I mean by that is that, incidents would obviously be, near misses, medical treatment, first aids, things like that, that you, well, certainly medical treatment, first aids are things that you really want to try and avoid happening, but near misses, observations, at-risk behaviors or conditions, those are what I describe as occurrences, events. And actually you want an awful lot of those, because the more events that you identify that could lead to something more impactful, the safety triangle, bird safety triangle that talks about the number of first aids or near misses and ultimately how that flows up. You really want to identify where you have those occurrences and identify many of them, because those can be used as precursor information towards something that is more hazardous.
Yeah.
And all of those generate a boatload of information here. But more importantly, the more you measure, the more you can respond to it. And also timeliness of that information, that response is critical. If you don't jump on an issue very, very quickly, people will move on. That's just the nature of, the nature of construction, the nature of human beings. They, look forward, not backwards. And anything that's paper related makes that whole process very, very tricky. And so, if information sits on paper and never ever gets used, it's not really doing work for you. And that's really one of the bigger challenges, alongside just simply debottlenecking what a foreman needs to do every single day. That information is incredibly valuable, it's incredibly insightful. And if people aren't able to make use of it, they're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table.
Yeah, as you, for the audience here, whoever's watching this, knows we are advocating for getting off of paper, and I think we're gonna hammer this, topic of digitization pretty hard, and have thus far. But bottom line is that health and safety is one of those areas of construction management that's just screaming out for more digitization. But in a bespoke kind of best in breed platform, lots of people have started to digitize safety forms, in a form builder. But I've seen and kind of experienced that can add more to the foreman's plate, basically giving them yet another tool to jump around to. So that is another tool they have to learn, that to interact with, and that detracts from kind of the job or task at hand. What we suggest and typically see with contractors we work with is giving them best in breed solutions for the applications they ask of their crews. So give them the best timekeeping tool, the best tools for tracking performance, and safety is really no difference. It should be treated just the same. What we're trying to do at Rhumbix, is build an app that allows the foreman to do much of what they need to do all in one easy to use tool. Foremen are the sharp end of the safety management stick, and anything a contractor can do to make their lives easier frees up time to focus on more valuable, value add tasks like ensuring safety and quality and actually productivity on the job site. We're always wanting to get more productivity, out of our crews and on the actual job sites, and having an easier safety management process and a way to actually put precautions in place, allows us to be more productive. So there's, correlation there. The bottom line really is digitization is where we're headed and where we need to head. But digitize very carefully in a way that considers the end user's experience, that being the foreman, the field leaders, and not just what the solution can do, but who's going to be benefiting from that and actually using, whatever solution on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm building on what Greg said. We think there are some real synergies from combining workflows in a single platform. And these are, to a great extent, driven by the experience of the foreman day to day, as the pointy end of the stick, as Greg suggested, but ultimately, data as well. And so for folks that are looking to get started, right, there are many, many really good safety applications out there. I mean, the folks at SafeSite and Foresight, we know very, very well, but SiteDocs, Lighthouse, Safety, Anchor Rock, HammerTech, there's lots of really, really good platforms out there for safety management. And that most of those are dedicated safety tools. And what we're trying to do is simplify what a foreman has to do by bringing multiple workflows into one tool. We firmly believe the foreman has specific tasks, right? Safety, crew management, timekeeping, production tracking, change management, daily reporting, inspections, checklist observations, all of those sorts of bits and pieces. And why shouldn't they be given a single tool that can do as much of that in a single platform as they possibly can, right? And if you think about the benefits of that, they've just got one single login, it's one user interface that they need to map. There's the opportunity to avoid that duplicate data entry and workflows that overlap. And so, I mean, if you think about that, right, you've got, think about headcount. So the names of the craft workers that are on your crew, right? You have that in T&M tickets, you have that in daily reporting, you have that in timekeeping, you have that on toolbox sorts and JHAs. All of those workflows include some component of who was on the crew on that particular day and maybe what they were working on. And fundamentally, that's absolutely what you get on a time card. So that's, there's real benefits and synergies there for the foreman. But abstracting that, there's real value to the companies themselves when it comes to technology selection. If you buy one tool or several tools instead of one for every one of those workflows, you have fewer integrations to manage, fewer costs that you have to carry, fewer tools that you have to train everybody in. That makes your IT infrastructure easier, your training and onboarding of new employees easier. And candidly, there's this whole concept of app and tech fatigue that is real, particularly with folks in the field who really struggle with the constant flow of tools down from corporate to the field, and it just creates this absolute digitization nightmare for the guys in the field. And so that's something that's really important. And then the final part about it is that there is real value in some of those core data areas, timekeeping being a prime example, when you start to overlay that with safety. I mean, safety, quality, and productivity go hand in hand. The data for those tells a very, very contextually rich story. So if you think about safety in general, right, it's how the industry tracks trends and performance. It is very much about how many hours you do with how many incidents you have. It's called the experience modification rate, the EMR. Whereas, the preventative work or the preventative performance, so how do you actually measure yourselves to prevent things in the future, is looking at how much risk you take on board or what your exposures might be based on the work that you're currently performing or upcoming tasks. And so both of those sets, the EMR and predictive safety metrics, predictive risk areas, is all a function of timekeeping or crew or the mix or the changes, right? It's all inherent in your timekeeping data. And for many people, timekeeping is done over here and safety is done over here. And bringing those two data sets together becomes really challenging and time consuming. And so we think that combining those in a single platform will drive huge efficiency gains for construction companies. But more importantly, it will deliver a fundamentally different data set for construction companies to actually leverage. So yeah, I mean, going back to that concept of managing what you don't measure, and I just attended a conference a week or so ago on construction analytics. And one of the big challenges that people were talking about is this concept of data cleanliness and data structure and data mapping and data relationships. And well, actually what they were talking about was the lack of all of those. They don't have cleverness, they
Yeah.
don't have structure.
Yeah.
And all of that is essentially driving the opportunity for AI and machine learning to really drive construction outcomes. Well, most of these construction companies really can't move the needle on this because their data is just a hot mess. And, this is where consolidation and standardization of workflow and systems starts to become super impactful, above and beyond what the foreman does day to day. That's a primary focus, but on the trailing edge of all of that is some of this really high value, business level, company level, strategic opportunity. And so fundamentally, just to sum it up, the fewer tools you have to manage, the cleaner your data, the better your data is going to become. And if you can do a better job with all of that and make the foreman's life experience, then it's win-win all around as far as we're concerned.
And I'll take this one. I think Guy hit on many of them, but really kind of anywhere your labor data, i.e., timekeeping, time cards, head count, crew mix, attendance, starts to interact with safety, which is basically everywhere. Those are those, key metrics we're looking at, we're wanting to measure and refine and improve upon. Some key performance indicators that we look at include, how frequently does a worker bounce between tasks? Projects or even crews that they're moving from job to job. This might then indicate or necessitate, level of change or exposure to a new or different risk. And then just general workplace complexity, which is undesirable. Which foremen and workers are working at which tasks for which relevant toolbox talk or JJ has not been performed. These are just some examples. More often than not, the only time folks realize that a required, workflow has not been completed for a task is in the event of an injury and immediate follow-up. This moves the burden of responsibility away from the crew. It's very difficult to manage this if the data is not combined and presented to you, as these expectations should be rare, but are absolutely key to identify early. And that's kind of the intersection of, labor data and safety data, which, Guy hit on. But really, Guy, anything more to add on that topic?
Yeah, no, I think the nexus of those two data sets just delivers so much opportunity. If you think about timekeeping and safety, right? Who is generating time cards, but not generating inspections or checklists at the rate desired, right? If a foreman's on a job every single day and doing timekeeping for a crew of 20, what would your expectations be around the number of observations or the number of inspections or the number of site walks that they do? How many toolbox talks should they do? What workers are on a time card in a particular week, but haven't signed a toolbox talk or a JHA, right? How do you use this information to manage by exception, right? If 99.99% of the time, everything's running really, really well, it's that 0.01% of the time where there's going to be an issue, and then you're found out. And it doesn't actually matter that you're compliant so much of the time, you are compliant that one time. And fundamentally, that's what's going to create a lot of issues for you. But then onto things like gamification. Can you gamify and incentivize safety tasks and crew-based performance metrics by bringing all that information together? At the company level, can you have a look at this information and see that, from timekeeping, you're doing an awful lot of work on rebar installation right now. And so maybe, from historical perspectives, that with rebar installation, you often get an excess of, hand injuries associated with the cut ends of rebar, and that you need to do a program on hand and glove safety or manual handling or shaking out rebar issues and things like that. So a lot of different sort of information and insights you can start to glean from that information. The risk, ultimately risk is all about risk and exposure and hazard, and exposure and risk is as much about the work activities that people are working on. And fundamentally, the best way of getting that information is from the timekeeping, because that tells you how many people you've got working on activities, what activities they're working on. And it's a huge part of that whole safety and risk consideration. So yeah, we think there's a huge opportunity to bring those two data sets together. And technology is a significant part of that.